Cat scratched me. Anyway, infallibility, slavery, the sensus fidelium, can the whole church err? Just some thoughts on this. Depending on what you mean by infallibility, it can already be like a very silly concept. Because think about this, the whole church can't err. In what sense is that true? Is there a single person on earth who will die and who will stand before God and who will say, oh, every single theological idea and belief I had in my mind, they were all correct. I'm not surprised in the least by any of this correcting anything inside my mind and my faith. No. There's never been a single Catholic or a single Christian since the death of the Virgin Mary who has entered into eternity and met God and not had the experience where there's at least something in their mind, something in their theological understanding that they realized, oh, that wasn't right. That wasn't correct. God corrects them about something. So every single person in the church, without exception, universally is in error, at least somewhere in their theological understanding. So in some sense, the sensus fidelium means, well, it doesn't mean in theology, but in reality, it's that the universal church is always universally in error. There is never a single person in the church who isn't in error at least somewhere in their theological understanding, such when they meet God, they'll realize, oh, I conceived of that wrong. Oh, this is how it is, right? So what then does infallibility mean? Well, it generally means that the whole church won't altogether hold like the same error. So the whole church won't altogether believe that sex outside of marriage is morally illicit. Or, the whole church in its pastors won't altogether teach as definitive this particular error. Or the leaders of the church, whether as an ecumenical council or a pope, won't definitively teach this particular error. So that's what infallibility means. But does that hold up when we actually look at history, setting aside the question of just like the fact that every single person in the church universally is always in error? Has there been times in the church where the pastors of the church altogether universally have taught the same error? Or where everyone in the church altogether has believed the same error? Now, there's a guy named John Noonan, I've talked about him before on my channel, who wrote a book called The Church That Can and Cannot Change. And he picks out three primary areas where he thinks there have been error. He talks about slavery, usury, interest on loans, and religious liberty, coercion of people based on their religious beliefs. Now, I've talked about some of those before, especially religious liberty. I'm doing sort of an in-depth study on that topic before I publish something because I want to be super certain that I have everything correct. But here I want to talk about slavery. When we talk about slavery and whether there's some moral error in the history of the church on the topic of slavery, there are some distinctions and qualifications and nuances that are important that people want to bring up, but sometimes people think they explain more than they do. First of all, when we're talking about slavery, when we're talking about whether there has been some contradiction in the church or some error in the church, we're not talking about every possible form of slavery, every single thing that could come under the heading of slavery. If that's what we were talking about, then even something as simple as arresting someone for a crime and putting them in jail could, at least theoretically, be called slavery, because you are locking them up. They no longer have any control over their life. They are your slave in a sense, as long as they're in jail. What we're talking about is those particular areas of practice where at one time the church universally accepted it as at least not intrinsically immoral, at least not in this fallen world. And now today, universally, we would say, no, this is intrinsically immoral. There's no justification, not even the fact that we live in a fallen world. Are there areas like that when it comes to slavery where there is a point of contact, where there is a genuine contradiction? Now, again, here, we have to focus in on very specific acts. Because if we're just talking about slavery in general, there'll be a lot of overlap and we can see a lot of continuity. For example, Christians always would have rejected the idea that you could like go into somebody's home and kidnap somebody and take them for yourself and enslave them. Like, say, for example, in the West African slave trade. Now, there were some Catholics and Christians who thought that it was morally justifiable once they had been slaves for 100 years. It's like, okay, well now, like, it's a different thing. It's not necessarily intrinsically immoral to keep them as your slave. But the original kidnapping, everyone would have always agreed like immoral. But there are specific kinds of slavery that were always accepted. I mean, the Pope, many popes, the papacy in the Vatican for a long time was run in large part by Muslim slaves that had been captives of war. And that's one particular kind of slavery that was always accepted by Christians everywhere. As if you go to war and you win that war, the enemy combatants, the soldiers on the other side who lost that war and who have surrendered to you, they are now your permanent slaves for life if you want them to be. And there's nothing immoral about that. That's you cannot condemn it as intrinsically immoral, even if maybe some Christians thought, probably not the best thing to do. They still wouldn't have said it's intrinsically immoral, as evidenced by the fact that the pastors of the church all did it, as evidenced by the fact that you can find no one protesting it, as evidenced by the fact that you can find everyone saying, yes, this is morally illicit in this fallen world. Now, today, would we say that that's morally illicit? Let's say, for example, we go to war with Iran, and we have boots on the ground, and we win that war, and the soldiers who fought for Iran surrender, and we lock them up, we put them in a factory, and we say, hey, look, for the rest of your life, you have to stay in this factory, you cannot leave, we're in control of your life, you're our slave, you're going to work for us, and we're going to give you food, and we're going to give you shelter, and we're not going to beat you, but you're our slaves for life, the rest of their life, even though they've already surrendered and the war's over. Would we say, universally, would we say that's intrinsically immoral? I think so. But if that isn't so clear to you, how about this? Now, after we've gone to a war with Iran, and we've taken those enemy combatants as our permanent lifelong slaves, and 10 years from now, in the factory, a couple of these slaves, let's say there were some female soldiers in there as well, along with the male soldiers, they give birth to some children. Now, these people who we've made our permanent lifelong slaves have had children while they are our slaves. What happens to those children? Well, it makes some sense that while they're young, they would stay with their parents and in some sense stay like under our custody because they're with their parents. But what happens when they turn 18? And they say, hey, look, I want to go to college. I want to go live my life. I want to go start a family. I want to move to, Mexico. I want to go move back to Iran or whatever. Would we have a right then to say, no, actually, you are our permanent lifelong slave. You have to stay where we tell you. You have to work for us your entire life. You have no right to leave because your parents who gave birth to you fought in a war against us, and they are our permanent lifelong slaves. Clearly, that would be horrendously unjustifiable. All of us today would be up in arms like, are you kidding me? You can't tell that kid that. He didn't do anything wrong to you. First of all, you shouldn't have even enslaved the parent for their life. But now the kid who's completely out of it, you're going to permanently enslave them for life? Well, guess what? That was universally accepted among all Catholics everywhere for hundreds and hundreds of years, all Christians everywhere, East and West, for for like over 1,000 years. It's not intrinsically immoral, they would say. They might say, you probably shouldn't do it. It's like, I wouldn't do it. I would probably buy that kid off of you and free him. I think we should get rid of this stuff as a society. But in this fallen world, it's not intrinsically immoral. And that's why you see, like, the Vatican doing it. That's why you see the pastors of the church doing it. And you can't find anyone protesting it as intrinsically immoral. So when you come to very specific acts, see, is there, and I'm not saying which one is right. I'm not saying we're right today, and I'm not saying they're right in the past. I'm just saying one of them has to be wrong. And that's where infallibility says, how can it be infallible? The whole church can't err if there's a direct, explicit point of contradiction that can in no way be reconciled. For 1,000 years, all Christians everywhere, East and West, all together, with the pastors of the church, saying, yeah, if you go to war and the other side loses, they're now your permanent slaves for life and any kids they have after that point. And today, we say, absolutely not. It doesn't matter how fallen this world is, that can't be justified. A clear point of contradiction. Now, if anyone's watching this video and they think I'm wrong about that, they think it wasn't universal then or now, I'm hoping to see the evidence. But that would just be one point where I'd say, and also other points, religious liberty, coercion of heretics, East and West, Orthodox and Catholics all together for 1,500 years, 1,000 years, all believed you had a moral duty to coerce heretics. Even something like exile, civil exile. You can't live in this land anymore. You have to go to another land because you're preaching heresy that's dangerous to souls. that would be excluded by what Dignitatis Humanae teaches about this fundamental human right, a civil right, a societal right to not be coerced in your religious faith. Anyway, that's another topic. Thanks for watching, guys.